Great, so this session is titled Open AI, ? Regulation for the Common Good. And as we know, 50 miles to the northwest, the primary focus of the Global AI Safety Summit is on existential so-called frontier AI and new dangers including bioweapons, cybercrime and deepfake capabilities will be discussed. But here, at the Making the Future Work Summit, we want to ground the debate in more immediate challenges and opportunities around work, the workplace, and working lives that are being transformed by AI. I'd like to introduce myself first. I'm Oliver Pickup, a technology and business journalist based here in London, although I was born in Stockport, and Philip, I can understand your desire to leave quite quickly. I'm joined by Abby, Dr. Abby Gilbert, Director of the Institute for the Future of Work. We've also got Florian, Dr. Florian Ostmann, Head of AI Governance and Regulatory Innovation at the Alan Turing Institute. Rebecca Thomas, Head of Employment Policy at the Equality and Human Rights Commission. And finally, Sid Chatterjee, Policy and Governance Strategist at Holistic AI. Now, the pressing question of how AI can or should be regulated is facing governments and policymakers across the world, as we know. But the issues faced by workplaces and sectors across the world, away from the technology industry, are real and immediate, and there's an urgent need to address them. I'm going to throw some stats at you now. The World Economic Forum predicts that a quarter of all jobs will be disrupted by the rapid adoption of AI over the next 5 years. The organization says there will be 14 million fewer overall jobs in 2028, with 83 million roles vanishing, yet only 69 million being created. Other sources disagree. McKinsey, however, calculates that AI will create 133 million new jobs by the end of the decade. And yet, and this is perhaps to Philip's point, found that low-paid workers are 4 times more likely to be replaced by AI than high-paid workers. Further, Goldman Sachs reckons AI could replace the equivalent of 30 million jobs, although hopefully human panel moderators are safe for now. The serious point is, while the UK government is making headlines about regulating AI, there are widespread concerns any laws and legislation may be too loose or too sluggish, or even if they focus on existential risks, too much of a distraction to be good and meaningful for businesses, or most importantly, their workers. I was really interested in Jolene's research there about how more AI means less quality of life. I work for myself, but if I was to work for a company that monitors my work at home, I might get one of those mouse jigglers for Christmas. You've heard about those? But anyway, again, being serious, Abby, I'd like to start with you, please. Could you talk about the wider risks of AI use in the workplace and how well they are considered by the current AI white paper and what might be included in the white paper after the AI Safety Summit that is relevant to this topic, please?
Sure, and thank you, Ollie. So yeah, I suppose it's, you threw some statistics out there around projections of automation risk, and there's obviously been a variety of ways within the academy of trying to estimate what these kind of impacts might be, with a really notable paper some years ago estimating 47% of jobs would be impacted. But when we try and unpack what that automation exposure looks like, then it requires us to think in more granular ways around how work is being reorganized, what that means for the quality of work, and also how value is being created, which is important in the light of the fact that the adoption of these technologies is happening with trade-offs to job quality, with variable productivity gains. So the real purpose and question is also to be, I suppose, interrogated there. So obviously the most sort of common imagined impact of technology on work is its displacement, the loss of jobs. And this is obviously a risk that does need to be better managed, and part of that is supporting transition, and then also potentially sort of welfare support as the role of the state in that context during that transition moment. But there's also positive outcomes of the potential of technology, like new job creation. Prompt engineers has emerged as a new role with significant returns in recent years. And also what we've described in a recent paper, reframing automation as high discretion augmentation. So where technology has been designed, developed or deployed to increase the opportunity for the worker to use their discretion in how they do their job and to supplement and aid them. So that might look like something to the effect of a surgeon using kind of robotic equipment to work remotely. We've heard in our own research in the PISA Readers Review that this was an empowering experience for those workers. And both in new job creation that's linked to the use of AI, and also in high discretion augmentation cases, the value that the worker feels they can contribute is also tending to be reflected in wages. And this is why there's often a focus on skills programs and creation of STEM jobs as part of the kind of main focus of conversations around AI and the future of work. Now that's important and that's great, and we need to see those kind of outcomes in practice. But the space of AI regulation arguably comes into some of the other kind of context that we outline in this paper, and that we think it's important for the broader conversation around what automation means to consider in order that we effectively understand what the risks and impacts to work might be. So to come to some of those other types of automation impact, the first that we might consider is the intensification of work. We've already had a little bit of banter about this morning, and obviously quite aside from the kind of scheduling of meetings, which might be an incidental kind of intensification impact, there's also now really direct evidence, and the key kind of media cases that exemplify this are drivers who are prevented from having toilet breaks as a result of the intensity of their required completion of driving jobs, or the kind of Amazon warehouse worker who has to deliver 95% task productivity rate in order not to get bumped off. So intensification is something that can be, obviously it's a managerial choice and an employment choice to allow an algorithm to manage people in that way. But then there are incentives and penalties like robo-firing that maintain compliance to that kind of routine. So that's one kind of set of risks to consider, and I know that we're going to get a chance to talk about regulation and precedents for managing this. They already exist around the world, so leading in that space is something that we need to think about. Another kind of impact is low discretion augmentation. So we talked about the kind of high discretion augmentation, arguably elsewhere described as upskilling in work. Low discretion augmentation reduces the choice environment of a worker to try and encourage them to comply with what seemed to be a single best method. And reduce the kind of contribution that they make to a role. So this could be something like an Uber driver following a route, and it could equally be, as we've seen in some of our own research, that workers input the methods of how they do something in a range of other sectors, and then a best method is chosen and they're encouraged to comply to that. Now, obviously, that has potential impacts on worker dignity, but also on the potential returns and benefits that they can have from work. There are obviously advantages in expanding the number of people who can use a method to achieve work and expanding and opening access to a market, much like we might see with the transformation from London taxi drivers to kind of Uber drivers who now don't need the internalized human capital, as some people might say, of those routes, which it creates these conditions. But then there can also be outcomes for pay that I suppose need to be considered in advance where these transitions are made. But then another significant, and the third one that I'll touch on now, form of automation is where the information processing capabilities of technology come to restructure exchanges within the market. Now, the clearest use case that we've seen talked about in this is hiring. But this kind of matching process is happening in a number of other contexts. So matching of workers to tasks within a job, which can be from within the scale of a firm, or equally, obviously, the most notable case of this is in the gig economy. Now, we've seen that algorithmic management platforms have been introduced into conventional sectors and are creeping across the whole sort of source of the economy. So this kind of question of matching has become more important. So I think I've probably given a broad introduction there, but we'll get on to maybe talk about some of the regulatory responses to that. Yeah, subsequently.
That's great. Thank you very much, Abby. Robo-hiring and robo-firing, how frightening. Sid, if I could turn to you now, because I know that you've got a view of what's happening around the world in terms of models for regulating workplace AI. Could you give us a run-through of what you're seeing and where the direction of travel might be here as well?
Certainly. Fasten your seatbelts. There's a lot to cover here. Regulation in the employment context is mostly centered, as of now, in the US and Europe. And they really look at different elements of employment. And starting kind of with state level regulation in the US, you've got the Illinois AI Video Interview Act, quite kind of self-explanatory. It requires transparency disclosures for employers using AI in video interviews. Also mandates such employers to report demographic data of the candidates they've interviewed through these means, and you can sort of versus those who kind of don't get the job and all of that. And there's also a very interesting right to be forgotten provision within this regulation, and it's been passed now, where candidates can actually request for data erasure within 30 days, and the employer has to comply. Otherwise, of course, there are fines and all of that. The second one is from New York, the very famous New York bias audit law, officially known as New York Local Law 144, that mandates independent annual bias audits of automated employment decision tools, AEDTs, and it also very usefully provides metrics on the same after kind of extensive consultation with the Department of Consumer and Worker Protection. Moving on, there's California, two kind of legislations emerging from there, both kind of at the proposal stage. So first of all, there is Assembly Bill 331, which looks at automated decision tools, so different articulations of the same tool for employment purposes, and it kind of mandates governance programs, which is sort of a risk assessment, as well as an impact assessment on an annual basis to be conducted for these. This is supplemented by California's Workplace Technology Accountability Act. That was a huge name, which is again very similar to AB 331. Also mandates impact assessments for employment decision tools, and also, to Abby's point, limits workplace monitoring, which is definitely a new thread of regulation that we're seeing, at least in the American context. Coming to DC, there is the Stop Discrimination of Algorithms Act, or the SDAA, which actively prohibits the use of personal data correlated with personal with protected characteristics to be used for algorithmic decision making. So we're anticipating that a lot of it will be pertinent to the employment context. And then there are two kind of overarching regulations at the federal level. There is the Algorithmic Accountability Act, the AAA, which was reintroduced, interestingly, for the third time last month, which mandates annual impact assessments of automated critical decision processes, so ACDPs. Again, the same thing, but sort of different sort of terminology, typology. And this actively covers kind of interventions of algorithms in employment, self-employment, and workers' management. And of course, there's the executive order. That came out on Monday. There's a specific section called Supporting Workers, Section 6, I think, in the executive order, wherein the Department of Labor is directed to issue guidelines, principles, best practices to address job displacement due to AI, worker data transparency, workplace monitoring, and also, very interestingly, mandate capacity building for kind of officials at federal agencies, etc. Moving on to the EU. There's a very famous EU AI Act, which is currently going through the trilogue process. It is expected to be finalized by the end of this year, though increasingly that's probably not the case. Employment decision systems are considered high risk. There's a bunch of things that they need to do to comply, such as conformity assessments, risk assessments, etc. And there is Spain's rider law, 9/21, which gives the presumption of employment to gig workers for the first time, something very new that we're seeing in regulation, and it also mandates transparency disclosures for algorithmic decision-making systems of platform economies. So yeah, it's quite a lot.
Well done, Sid. That was a great whistle-stop tour. And hearing that, Rebecca, where are we at now, would you say, with the UK? And what would you suggest are the best regulatory methods and tools to address the equality risks of AI in the workplace?
So, I mean, in terms of the current regulatory framework in relation to equality and the principle of non-discrimination, the EHRC's view is essentially that the Equality Act, as it stands, provides that regulatory framework through which instances of discrimination or bias can be addressed. The challenge we've got is the fact that this is, sort of an exponentially increasing and innovative environment, which means there is a potential then for regulatory gaps which needs to be addressed. The other thing that we're really mindful of too is the fact that we're operating in a global context. So while we have this domestic framework, many of the organisations that are subject to equality law in the UK are also going to be subject to other jurisdictions and are going to have initiatives or approaches or policies or practices that adhere. So I think one of the things that we are looking to see from the government is a model of collaborative regulation that operates within this global context, which also addresses the very specific needs of Britain's workers and Britain's employers, and can move at pace to plug regulatory gaps. I think there are a range of innovations we're seeing in this space already that support improved regulation or increase awareness of regulatory compliance. I just think if you look at, certainly the work that you're doing, Alan Turing Institute, around standards, I think that's a fantastic way to explore, much needed, particularly in employment context, because absolutely that is framed within a sort of, a kind of a European, an American, a global context. Certainly the work that the ICO is doing around sort of regulatory sandboxes is really helpful, certainly something that we are very keen to explore. And then the EHRC sort of standard approach is to progress at the kind of the softer end of regulation in the first instance, so lead with guidance and sort of capacity building and awareness raising in terms of obligations and duties. So last year, for example, we published guidance on the use of AI in public services. There's a particular benefit that the Equality Act provides in relation to public sector organisations because they have duties under the Public Sector Equality Duty Section 149 of the Equality Act, which means there is a proactive obligation on public sector bodies to take steps to consider the impact of their policies, their practices and so on. So that provided us with a really clear opportunity to kind of clarify what Equality Act compliant deployment of AI looks like. And that was, I think there's been a great deal of pickup of that. It's been a really useful framework also for private sector employers, and I think this is one of the other regulatory challenges for us, that there is the potential for gaps in relation to private sector organisations when it comes to employment obligations, and that's something that warrants careful and close attention. The other point I would make around sort of we talk about regulation and we talk about enforcement. When it comes to equality law, there is a dual enforcement approach. Now, obviously, we have the EHRC as the statutory regulator for the Equality Act, but we are a very small organisation. And to date, we haven't heard much in the way of a commitment from government to invest greater resource across the regulators involved in this space. But that is absolutely fundamental to support compliance and ensure that sort of issues around discrimination and bias are addressed effectively. But in an employment context specifically, the onus essentially is on the individual to take a claim to tribunal. And one of the big challenges we see in AI is around the issue of transparency. A lot of the time individuals are not going to understand or even be aware of whether AI is being used in the first place, or if it is, whether there is a discriminatory outcome. So actually in terms of awareness of rights and being able then to enforce rights and secure redress, there is a really big gap.
That's great, thank you, Rebecca. And just picking up on a couple of the points there, you mentioned the work the Turing Institute is doing there. Florian, could you just tell us about the Standards Hub and how well are the workplace risks, as mentioned by Abby and others, considered in these standards, and how they're well suited to governance of socio-technical risks?
Yeah, thank you. So the AI Standards Hub is a partnership between the Alan Turing Institute, the British Standards Institution, and the National Physical Laboratory, which is the Measurement Institute in the UK. And we launched the hub a little more than a year ago. It grew out of the National AI Strategy. We're working very closely with DCIT and other parts of government in delivering it. And the focus is, I should say, a bit more about what we mean by standards in that context. So the focus is on standards that are developed in organizations such as ISO at the international level, for example, or Sensenelec at the European level. There are many others, of course, but in other words, organizations that are recognized formally as standards development bodies that have a history in many other areas of industry and engineering and technology, and increasingly are working to develop standards for AI technologies. So the mission of the hub is to raise awareness for the role of those types of standards in the AI governance context. It's sort of reflective of the fact that I think around the world we've seen growing attention on the role of standards as a governance tool. for a variety of reasons. So, for example, in the EU AI Act, there's a particular specific role for standards, which I'll say more about in a moment. There is, of course, the view that standards may be able to fill gaps where regulation isn't existent and may sort of provide sort of a widely agreed best practice that industry actors and others can agree on to fill gaps. But it can also help to facilitate the implementation of regulation. And sort of important aspect there is the fact that regulation, in many cases, remains at a fairly high level to set out principles or set out general requirements, and standards can provide sort of the necessary detailed guidance, on what those requirements mean in practice. And I'll say a bit more about, how that works in the European context, because it will have quite significant implications for the UK ecosystem. So in the EU context, we've heard already about the EU AI Act, which has a category of high-risk AI applications, of which a range of applications in the recruitment employment context form part of. Now, one aspect of the EU AI Act is to set out a set of requirements that developers of AI systems that are considered high risk need to comply with. Requirements around documentation, record keeping, testing, different forms of assurance, and so on. Now, within the EU, generally speaking, there's a concept of harmonized standards. And what those standards do, those are standards developed by CEN-CENELEC. Once they're adopted by the European Commission as a harmonized standard, they create a legal presumption of conformity with the regulation. That is to say that in order to show conformity with the regulation, it's sufficient to have conformed and show conformity with the standard. And as a result, it's not necessary for organizations to use that standard, but it's by far the most efficient way to show compliance. And so as a result, those standards are expected to be very widely adopted and have really significant impact, including for any developer in the UK that seeks to do business in the EU market. Now, I think you raised the question partly around what's the role of standards in the employment context, and to what extent do we see standards development activity focused on the kinds of use cases that we're talking about today. I think the short answer to that is that we've seen limited activity that's specifically focused on standards for AI in recruitment tools, for example. But that isn't to say there's a lot of activity that's relevant. So what we've seen so far is a lot of activity that's focused on horizontal standards. And Adam Leon-Smith, if anyone has detailed questions on this, Adam Leon-Smith is in the audience. He's a key UK representative in lots of those working groups and committees. Will be able to share more details. So there are lots of horizontal standards that are designed, to set out risk management processes, for example, for AI developed in any context, and those will of course be relevant, to any use cases in the employment context. Now, the big question, of course, is what is the gap that's left by these horizontal standards? So what are the areas where, in order for standards to be meaningful, we need something specific, that sets out requirements or test methods or metrics that are, specifically designed for the employment context. And I think it's quite clear there will be a need for some vertical standards, but what exactly the mix will look like is sort of ongoing debate.
Yeah, absolutely. And perhaps I can bring you back in, Rebecca, as well, because you touched upon this as well, talking about transparency, fairness and bias in AI systems. Is this the same as equality, and how would you assess where the current regimes are now?
Well, I mean, fairness is one aspect of equality. I think we also need to look at sort of both opportunity and outcome then as a result. So actually what is the outcome for the individual who is subject to the deployment of AI in a particular employment context? So I think if you look at the proposals that are coming from the government in the AI white paper, there is reference to bias and fairness and non-discrimination. Which is a sort of a helpful start, but it's not sort of clearly articulated, and possibly because what they're trying to do is develop a regulatory approach and a set of principles that are going to be relevant to all sort of case uses. So in terms of the kind of the point around transparency, I think actually fundamentally this is where we're going to see the biggest challenge. So both in terms of the individual being able to secure redress, as I said, but also around ensuring that the employers, the organisations using AI are accountable, that they are preemptively accountable, that they take steps in the first instance to make sure that the deployment of AI in their specific sector or workplace is compliant with equality law. One of the other points I just wanted to make sort of more generally was the fact that this is wider than equality. It also engages human rights, and in particular sort of the right to just and favourable conditions at work under the International Convention on Economic and Social Cultural Rights. Yeah, I may need to come back to that. But actually what we're seeing in terms of, what Abby was saying at the start was actually that there is going to be very real sort of detriment to workers engaged in certain sectors, in certain types of roles. That's going to increase exponentially. The challenge, I think, for all of us in terms of trying to develop approaches, whether it's standards or whether it's sort of regulatory mechanisms or whether it's government policy and strategies, is the fact that we're already dealing with structural inequality, which means that certain groups are overrepresented in sectors or in areas where they might disproportionately be at risk of the negative impact of the use of AI. And that requires a much more sort of fundamental reconsideration of what's happening in the labour market, what sort of labour market trends we're seeing, and what steps can be taken to address that. So I'll just give you a really quick example. If you look at, for example, 0 hours contracts or gig economy work, what we're seeing is younger workers, older workers, women, and certain ethnic minorities overrepresented in those groups. If they are then subject to further detriment as a result of bias and discriminatory outcomes through the increased deployment of AI, then that just sort of entrenches inequality further. And we haven't seen anything that sort of fully addresses or grapples with this from a UK government policy perspective.
Abby, you're itching to come in, please. Just a reminder, get your questions in, because I'm going to go to the iPad now next.
Thanks, Annie. I suppose I just wanted to start with the fact that in my household, my home household, my dad actually brews his tea for precisely 3 minutes, recorded on his Apple Watch, because that is what the ISO standard says is an appropriate way to brew tea. I come from a family background of a big, strong support for ISO standards. However, the limitation, I suppose, of these approaches is that, and this is one of the excellent things that I think that the Turing Standards Hub is doing, is creating a space for reflection on their adequacy or inadequacy with commentary on them. But unfortunately, this kind of marketplace of assurance approach to the governance of AI means that often people who are subject to these decisions don't even know what that standard is asking of them unless you've sort of bought into it, which is delimiting for a kind of overarching governance strategy. So to pick up on that, I think in relation to these transparency points, and then also some of what Sid touched on, and to give an example of how we can have a baseline that is asking for more than this and how that's demonstrated in international precedent already. The New York hiring law requires for independent audits which then disclose how trade-offs were made during the process of designing a system. So, as has been touched on by Rebecca, there are inherent trade-offs in the design of these systems, and those are the kind of decisions that are made behind closed doors, but that are what would determine an organisation being accountable for the potentially discriminatory effects. If there's not a mandate to disclose that, then organisations, as well as needing more resourcing and capacity, like the EHRC, won't be able to necessarily do the good work that they need to do as these systems expand across space. But equally, there's precedent for thinking about impacts on different types of job quality dimension, again, as picked up by Rebecca, with something like the Platform Workers Directive, which demonstrates that you can actually be doing assessments ex ante, i.e. before, and ex post after, after they're deployed, for impacts to well-being and psychosocial harm, so going beyond just the sense of physical harms within the health and safety space to also think about different types of impacts. And then equally with this kind of issue, as we talked about earlier and as touched on by Sid, around robo-firing and disclosure of what's happening in a process of how you're being judged and evaluated, the Warehouse Worker Act will allow you to know and understand as an individual, and then also representative organisations, what the kind of performance thresholds are for knowing whether or not you're doing your job well, which seems to be a sort of basic fair baseline for understanding how a system is reaching evaluations and judgments about you. I just wanted to sort of throw those in.
Well, Abby, while you're there, I mean, I understand that the Institute for the Future Work is developing a principles-based approach to best practice AI regulation for the common good. Could you elaborate a little bit on that? Are we allowed to talk about that?
Yeah, it's not a secret. It's
Great,
definitely not a
great.
secret.
Just
We talk about
checking.
it whenever we get the chance to. So yeah, I suppose there's now a growing precedent, both in the statement released by Biden yesterday and the G7 and a number of other spaces, which I'm sure you'll hear about in the final session today, for an agreement around identifying stakeholders that are impacted before a system is introduced, evaluating what their impacts might be, mitigating them, and then creating an ongoing monitoring architecture, because the impacts of these systems can evolve over time, and also the way in which they'll restructure social reality and shared relationships is also something that needs ongoing attention. And at the Institute, we were actually fortunate enough to be given the opportunity by the Information Commissioner's Office to think about, in this particular instance, data protection as a gateway to the preservation of wider fundamental rights, and developed a resource called Guidance and Methodology for Good Work Algorithmic Impact Assessment. So we understand, I suppose, the common good to be something that's an outcome of good work, but by which we give reference to the Good Work Charter, which is a summary, a kind of framework to align aspiration and action as you're designing technology within a workplace or undertaking processes of industrial strategy and future development. So what we're really excited about, I suppose, as we move forward in this agenda is both continuing to engage in processes which observe precedent and what's going on, and we hope to do that with Phoebe Moore in relation to algorithmic regulation, build capacity of people at different levels, both workers to understand what their rights are, but then also organisations in thinking about what responsible practices are, but then also create an environment for kind of reflexive iteration of the interpretation of some of these higher order principles in practice through a sandbox that we're excited to launch in the new year, and which will bring together different regulators to think about how the application of this kind of infrastructure at the scale of a workplace, what the lessons are and insights for their different regulatory regimes and apparatuses, think about these things in a cross-cutting way.
That's great. Thank you very much, Abby. We'll move on to some questions now. We've got about 10 minutes left, and he was mentioned before, but Adam Leon Smith has a good question here. In many regulated sectors, machinery, manufacturing, medical devices, standards bodies are working hard to provide application-specific soft law for the use of AI, for example, on bias. The HR employment sector and the UK trade unions are notable by their complete absence in the standards ecosystem. Why? Florian, I'm looking at you. I don't know if you want to take it on?
Yeah, maybe, yeah, that's a good point to come back also, in response to what Abby mentioned earlier. I think I did want to emphasize my agreement, of course, with the point that it's absolutely key for, all perspectives and all affected stakeholder interests to be represented in the standards development process. And in fact, that's one of the main reasons for having set up the AI Standards Hub. So what we're trying to do as part of the Hub's mission is to make it easier for all stakeholder groups to sort of navigate the landscape and understand, what are the particular standards projects that they should engage with in terms of, having impact and influencing, shaping the standards that will impact their interests. And we know that, going to the question, trade unions, for example, and other civil society organizations for that matter find it particularly challenging often to engage with the space, partly because it's fairly complex, partly because it uses its own language, and then of course partly also due to resourcing constraints and sort of the time that's needed to get involved in the process. And so those are some of the central things we're trying to address. The other thing I wanted to mention is, sort of going back to the work that Abby just mentioned, I think a part of our mission is also to make sure that there's a conversation or facilitate conversations between the work that's happening in standards bodies and sort of the wider ecosystem of best practice thinking. And I think the UK ecosystem is a case in point, especially in the employment and recruitment context. There's been so much important work on best practice, including the work that Abby just mentioned, and other work that the Institute for the Future of Work has done to sort of show thought leadership in this space, but also work that CDI has done and the TUC and others. So I think there is sometimes a risk because of the standards development process being its own process, some of that work not necessarily finding its way into those conversations, and it's part of what we're trying to address.
That's great, thank you. There's a question here from Ben Loxton, which actually touches upon a few things that we've said before about, I think Sana in the first panel said we need to get rid of the idea of AI. But the question is, how common are definitions of AI across different laws? New York 144 can cover anything from using a computer. Is there a risk that definitions are so broad they overwhelm? Sid, would you like to take that on, or anyone else like to take that on?
Absolutely, I'm happy to start and everyone can sort of jump in. Because the global AI governance sort of moment that this is just so novel, there is just so much disagreement, divergence, lack of consensus on how do you actually want to address these risks, and in a way of doing that, how do you want to look at these sort of different machines, so to speak. And there is no one right answer. We believe that kind of and we state that always. Given how early we are in the regulatory context and the regulatory conversation, it will definitely take a combination and amalgamation of different definitions, efforts, sort of combination of different regulatory tools to see what are the most fit for purpose ones, what are those that are hampering innovation, what are those that are jeopardizing safety, etc. And the articulation of automated employment decision tools in the New York law is a manifestation of that. There have been several public consultations. We've also participated in some of them where we've kind of, we've recommended kind of, focusing the terminology a bit more, but it remains to be seen as to how it goes. One good precedent that maybe these emerging regulations can take from is from the EU AI Act. For example, in Annex 3, Part 4A and B, the EU AI Act is very clear on what it's actually looking at in terms of regulation in the employment context. It is looking at everything from job targeting, job ads, the user algorithms in promotion, hiring, as well as filtering candidates, etc. So I think that kind of clarity is what is required, and I think standards will play definitely a huge role in that. Foundational standards, of course. And just two more points, if we've got some time. To Abby's point about the New York hiring law, it is, while it's the first of its kind, it's great that all of this is happening. It's still an outcome audit, so we still need to audit the outcome of the process and not the process itself. And people and employers can contravene that process. They can adjust numbers, and that can be in violation of the Civil Rights Act in the US. So we also try to call for holistic auditing of these practices by looking not only at the outcome, but also at technical elements, governance, etc. And again, I'll link it back to Florian. Standards such as ISO 42006, 42001, at least for the emerging assurance market, will be very, very useful in kind of providing the boundaries and the contours of what should be, what should not be, and this would really benefit the auditing market as well. Yeah.
Does anyone else want to come in on that? Or one of the questions here from Anna is, can you say more about any regulatory gaps that have already been identified in the context of work? I don't know, Rebecca, is there anything else that we can discuss here?
I mean, nothing specific at this stage. I think one of the challenges we have got is that we are lacking in a domestic context in terms of case law. So a lot of the case law in relation to the use of AI stems from Europe. So there is obviously pre-Brexit, there was relevance in terms of the interpretive effects and the impact of that case law in a UK context. So I think there is certainly learning, and that we can anticipate potential gaps from that. But because of the nature of legal challenge within domestic courts, the fact that it takes a really long time, I think at this point we're a relatively unknown space in terms of what's happening in courts at the moment, and what might happen in terms of newer forms of AI, what's happening around foundational models and the impact that might have. We already know that there is a potential for discriminatory outcomes in certain use cases, and we can anticipate that, and to an extent the legal framework is sufficient, but there may be unforeseen consequences or outcomes that we're not yet privy to, or that we're not yet seeing judgments about, which may indicate that there is a regulatory gap.
That's great. Also, yes, please, Ron.
Add a couple of comments to that. So I think one angle that's useful to take in that context, thinking about gaps, is to think about the contrast between areas that are covered, at least at the principal level, by fairly clear, existing law or regulatory requirements. And discrimination and equality law is one such area where there are very clear principles, and it's a matter primarily of thinking of how they apply to AI use cases. But if you think about sort of the broader range of impacts, and I think some of them mentioned also in the previous panel, there are quite a few that don't neatly fit into any existing legal or regulatory categories. So to think about sort of the impact on autonomy, perceived autonomy of workers, intensification of work, the psychological impacts of that, or perceived impacts on dignity. So I think there's a whole range of societal and ethically relevant impacts that don't necessarily fall into those existing categories. Of course, the existing categories are key. So discrimination is perhaps the most salient issue. Privacy issues are particularly salient, but there is a whole range of other issues that I think need to be thought of in identifying potential gaps.
And I think as well, just to pick up on that point too, is that there is, potentially a complex interplay in terms of the equality framework and the data protection and the privacy framework, and that obviously necessitates close interaction, collaboration between EHRC and the Information Commissioner's Office. And we have a memorandum of understanding between the two organisations to facilitate that sort of collaboration, because actually I think there are going to be a number of important tests coming up as we progress in this space to ensure that there is a more sort of coherent and comprehensive regulatory framework, because what the challenge I think is to users of AI, employers, organisations, is the fact that they're going to have multiple legal frameworks with which they need to comply, and how do they do that in the most effective and efficient way. I'm also mindful of the fact that if you look at the powers of the Information Commissioner's Office, they can issue fines. The EHRC can't do that. So that there is a financial incentive in some ways for an organisation to comply with data protection requirements, but less so in terms of its discrimination, the potential for discrimination. And as I said, that's then compounded by the dual enforcement approach that the Equality Act is subject to. So very much the importance of collaboration to address regulatory gaps, I think, is something we're going to look at in greater detail.
That's great, thank you very much. It all comes back to the analogy that was alluded to in the first panel. Wilson said it, the blind man and the elephant. I love that, and so much of this is about talking to one another and collaboration. We're almost out of time now. I wonder, given the title of the session, Open AI, Regulation for Common Good, if there's final comment from all the panelists, any sort of hopes, practical hopes? I don't know, Abby?
Well, I suppose it's great to be having this conversation today and building on the work that we've been doing for a couple of years. It's definitely the case. I think you're right that there need to be more of those kind of joined up conversations, and I look forward to working with those here and others in the room on our role at the Institute in shaping that going forward.
Yeah, I think maybe to echo that, the kind of conversations that we're having today, I think to emphasize the need to think about the full range of governance tools and mechanisms, starting with regulation on one side, guidelines and tools on the other end, and a call to action to join us in terms of what we're trying to do with the AI startups if you haven't engaged with us before.
And I mean, to echo as well what panelists have said in terms of continuing to work together to explore good practice and how to improve standards and compliance. I think the other point that I just wanted to make as well is the fact that, the use of AI in an employment context does have the power to innovate and to create more inclusive and greater opportunities for people with protected characteristics, or those who traditionally have been, faced challenges accessing or remaining in the labour market. And I'm really keen to look at how we create a narrative that establishes good governance, good regulation, but actually, recognises the transformative and not just disruptive effects of AI in the workplace, so that we can get that greater good.
That narrative, that storytelling is important actually as well, isn't it? Sid, final thought, please.
The perils of being the last person on the panel. I think everyone's covered all points, but I'd just say that I think we're at a place in terms of governance where there are different spheres of governance. There's standards, there's assurance, we do that. There's regulation, there's legislation, there's kind of guidance, and of course the wonderful work that the EHRC does. I think there is a definite need for more conversation and collaboration between all of these, making sure that different languages are not being spoken across, and there are interplays that are happening. All with a view not to only safeguard the rights of workers, but also to make sure that those who want to innovate in this space are able to do so in a safe manner.
That's fantastic. Thank you very much to Sid and all of my